This podcast was produced from a webinar. For a more interactive experience with visuals, visit advancedmanufacturing.org/webinars.
Hello, I'm Carrie Gitter, Associate Editor at SME Media. Welcome to another SME Media webinar. Our topic today is Additive Manufacturing Market Trends and Successful Strategies During Consolidation. And our presenter is Matthias Schmidt-Lehr, who leads Strategy and Business Development Initiatives for AMPOWER. In this capacity, he works closely with top-tier AM providers. Founded in 2017, AMPOWER is a global consultancy for industrial additive manufacturing, and it provides a variety of industry studies and technology reports. That's it from me for now. Matthias, take it away.
All right, Carrie, thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation to start this webinar. My name is Matthias Schmidt-Lehr. I'm one of the three founding partners at AMPOWER. We founded the company 2017 in Hamburg. We're also still based in Hamburg with a team of about 10 people now, working primarily and only in the area of metal additive and polymer additive manufacturing. I want to start by giving a very brief overview of our company, then diving into some of the trends that we currently see in the additive manufacturing market. And then I'm going to continue to the second part of diving deeper into the topic of AM strategies, in particular relation to supply chain of additive manufacturing, but also with a brief outlook into particular points of a user strategy for additive. Let's give a brief overview of our company. As I said, we are founded 2017. We serve three different customer groups. The first one is a group of investors, companies who like to invest into additive manufacturing or into startups or who want to enter the market. We support those companies with things like due diligence, M&A or matchmaking. We also support startups in finding investors or finding the right partners to grow, especially in the current phase where consolidation plays quite an important role. This topic has been growing in our company in the past 2 years, I would say. The second two groups of our customers are suppliers of additive manufacturing. That's, I would say, the largest customer group. So those are machine OEMs, those are material suppliers, those are software vendors or service providers of additive. Companies seek our advice, especially in the area of go-to-market strategy. As I said, the market is getting more competitive. It was already getting more competitive when we started in this area. 3D printing by itself didn't sell itself anymore. So companies need to be much more taking care of a specific go-to-market strategy. It was not enough just offering a fancy 3D printer anymore that was printing polymer or metal parts. Last but not least, the third customer group is the user of AM. I would say probably the smallest customer group right now. We have some very selected customers, especially in the area of implementing AM. This has been what we started with originally, but over the years it transitioned a little bit towards the supply chain. So our first projects, 2017, were mostly circling around qualification of AM. So there was a time when many companies, especially in medical and aerospace, were starting to implement AM, and they were looking for a strategy how to qualify the technology for production-ready parts. This phase changed a little bit with more standards coming up, with more best practices coming up. Those services are not as important anymore. It's still qualification, still an important area. So some of the customers we have there are mostly in fields where additive hasn't had that strong traction. So, for example, we had a couple of clients in Japan recently who entered the additive world quite late. And who were looking for a decent strategy and roadmap to implement AM into their corporate structure. Let me continue by losing a few words on some of the data that we generate in our work. So, as I said, we look a lot into strategies for AM, explicitly for go-to-market strategy or user implementation strategies. And one of the resources we use is our market report. We published the first report in 2019, so 2 years after we started the company. We first worked with other market data that is available, but it was also time, 2017, 18, when we saw the first signs that some of the data that we've come across out there we thought was overrated. It was a bit of a bubble creating. So some of the data did not reflect what we saw in the market and what we got as feedback from the supply chain in terms of machine sales, installed base, material use, etc. So we decided end of 2018 to start working on our own report. And we wanted to do a couple of things different, and those things I want to highlight quickly. First thing is, and you see it on the top left side, we wanted to focus on users. So typically how a report is done, how you gather market data is by asking the supply chain. So you ask the machine OEMs how many machines they sold, in which regions, which technologies, which industries, etc. And you then multiply that into the market, you scale it in the market, and then you have a magic model somewhere behind it, and that generates the global market data. Some reports just ask like 10 or 15 leading suppliers, which is quite difficult in AM because we have roughly about 600 machine OEMs supplying AM machines into that market. And there are many that are still strongly growing, especially in the startup field, but others that are also very settled already and are not growing at all right now or even shrinking. So it's a bit more difficult than if you compare it with traditional markets and market analytics. We wanted to bring the perspective of the user into this equation explicitly because we think users are using the technology completely different. For example, many might assume that those machines, or depending on where you're from, you might assume that those machines are running at like 80, 90% utilization rate. But if you start talking a little bit to users, you quickly realize that's not really true. Many of those machines are still in certain R&D environment or in a certain prototype or jigs and tools fixtures environment, where you typically have utilization rates rather around 60, 65% or in that range. So this is one of the aspects we wanted to bring into the equation. The other thing is why we talk to users is the forecast. We want to know from users what their demand is. And that explicitly gets interesting once users have a more clear picture on where additive is heading within their company. 10, 15 years ago, it would have been difficult because they would have told you, well, we just buy one machine from each technology. We just try everything out. Others would have been extremely progressive and positive and enthusiastic about AM, telling you extremely overrated volumes that they assume. Now, though, and that started already when we did our first report, if you talk to the big companies that already own 5, 6, 7 or more machines in an industrial environment, they can often give you a very clear forecast in terms of what capacity they need in the next 5 years. That's the typical span that we ask. So if you ask a medical company, for example, they know very well how much capacity they will need in the future, how much material they will use, which kind of programs they will implement, so which kind of new products they bring to the market in relation to additive. And it's similar to companies like aerospace or energy. So they have often fixed programs where they know pretty much very exactly how and which kind of capacity they will need in the future. So this is something we do different in the report versus others. I want to highlight one more difference that is actually, I see it's not on this slide, but I want to mention it because it's very important to us. We don't publish direct numbers from any OEM. So we realized with more competition coming up in the market that companies were holding back exact numbers or over-exaggerating numbers they are publishing if they know they turn up in some report. And we quickly realized when talking to those OEMs that a trustful relationship was very helpful in establishing a very transparent data exchange, and by giving them also certain data points back, we were able to build a very trustful relationship to many of those buyers, enabling us to get very precise data from this market. This also accounts for regions where it's very difficult for some to get data, explicitly in China. In China, you need to have boots on the ground. You need to have a very trustful relationship with each player in order to get good and correct data of those markets. All right, so what we do, overall, this report is looking at metal and polymer, looking at a 5-year time span. It's based on interviews. It's based on about 300 interviews for each report, plus all additional data from stock exchange markets or other data that you can find everywhere around in the market. So that's one of the tools that we're using for. It's a baseline, let's say, for many of the projects we do. And in the next couple of slides, I want to give a few more insights into what we found in the latest report we published. So first of all, this is the market as we scope it. So we talk about 3 major segments in the market. That's equipment first, that's material second, and it's part manufacturing, the third group. Now, we talk about the numbers a bit later. I want to still talk a little bit about the definition. It's important to say equipment starts at 10K. Next year report will also include everything below 10K. So we're currently working on an approach, which needs to be completely different because the supply chain looks different in this area. But it becomes more and more important. The below 10K segment is in often cases replacing now machines that had been above 10K, easily above 10K, even more sometimes. So these segments becomes extremely important for the industrial 3D printing world as well. So we will integrate that in the next report. Part manufacturing is an important sector as well, and we need to differentiate it a little bit because part manufacturing here in our context means 3D printing part suppliers. There might be companies who are actually end users of parts, who supply the companies who supply parts into a very specific market, for example, the medical market, and they act as a tier 1 supplier for the medical market. Those are not included here. Those are companies who are pure play 3D printing part suppliers. That's important, an important aspect as well. Let's talk a bit about the numbers, and I created a bit more interactive overview of, let's say, the key points that we found, and then afterwards we dive into a couple of other numbers. So first of all, the top left corner, the global market was about 2% growth last year, which basically in 3D printing terms, it's flatline. Before the years, it was always 10% plus growth. So we are for the first time below double-digit growth. Actually, I think COVID also had a less than double-digit growth, but 2% is quite low. And the big question is why? Interestingly, if we look at units, I don't have this number included here, but if we look at units, it actually increased much higher. The unit number increased over 2%. It was not more closer to the 10% rate, which indicates that the average price per machine decreased. And that goes into the same direction that I mentioned before. We have a flood of lower cost machines, lower cost printers in the market, which means that companies are investing less in terms of euros, while they still increase their investments in terms of units. Also, what we saw is that many end users, are turning to utilization instead of increasing capacity. You can always try to find other reasons in terms of high interest rates or something that might have driven them to postpone certain investments in industrial machines. But also many users you talk to today try to get more out of their machines by increasing utilization. And that has clearly been a trend last year. If we look at regions, the top middle field, we see a clear trend in extended growth in revenues in the APAC area, explicitly in China. But also in some other areas. Japan is growing and India are growing. Both are much later to the game than other countries. But also China saw a continuous growth. Europe and US was a bit more challenging when it comes to the equipment revenue. Let's be clear on that. This percentage rate here is only covering the equipment side of things. And that has been more difficult in those two markets. We clearly see a certain saturation happening. If we look at industries, automotive has a challenging time in AM. They see a certain barrier in terms of prototyping jigs, tools, fixtures. This market is very interesting, but you see the increase in utilization happened more here than in other areas. So companies try to do more with their machines internally. Their material consumption actually increased, but they didn't necessarily invest into new machines. We also see other effects here, of course, like electrification is a much more important topic right now, and in certain investments here in 3D printing equipment got postponed. Defense, on the other hand, was the clear winner last year. It was already the year before one of the clear winners. The defense area is gaining strength still in additive manufacturing. I don't see that happening for the next 10 years in that growth rate. So there's a certain investment power right now in this area. But at some point, you will also see a saturation there, and it will not continue like that. Looking at materials, similar to equipment, you see an increase in revenue, but a much more increase in tons, so in material volume, which indicates, again, a decrease in pricing. So the average price per ton or per kilogram decreased here. It was not a shift in the type of material, which might also be a reason for this development. Let's have a quick look at technologies. Here we have a clear winner in terms of ARC DED and also the other DED technologies, so directed energy deposition technologies have been winning. Polymer powder bed is a bit under pressure, but again, not necessarily in units. We saw lower cost machines like the Fuse 1 from Formlabs increasingly penetrating the market, which with a much lower investment price point compared to the large industrial machines from the US for Soon or others. Pellet material extrusion, also a very interesting niche market. So especially in the industrial area, when we look at materials like ULTEM, PEI, PEEK, etc., pellet extrusion becomes a very interesting alternative. Given the time, I want to move forward because I'm realizing otherwise I'm getting a bit slower. Let's switch to the other one in case there's questions later on. We see also the supply growth slows down, especially this year. I think the chart here in the next year's report will be much more compelling. We have, like I said, about 600 suppliers right now providing more than 600 suppliers providing machines into the market. And this year alone, I am aware of at least 20 or 25 companies who have left the space. And we see much less startups coming up. It's much more difficult to get investments, as also the next page is showing. If we look at actual funding, so this is the recordings of public funding rounds in additive manufacturing. We saw 2024 already much less volumes of funding. Now, this might be always a little bit delayed. Sometimes we don't have all the 2024 fundings in here. Just keep that in mind. It might actually be a bit higher because sometimes fundings are getting published a bit later after the closing. But it goes into the direction also of what we saw when talking to companies, talking to investors, or talking to startups. And 2025 might have some return there, might not get further down. But what we definitely see is that investments by larger corporations into additive manufacturing supply chain, not in the utilization, not as a user, but into the supply chain is definitely shifting towards lower numbers. Consolidation continues. If we take the example of metal PBF, the probably most interesting, largest market in AM, from an industrial perspective at least. Metal PBF is consolidating. We have about 10 top PBF OEM now covering about 80% of the market. But still keep in mind that the average revenue from each company is still at a very low end. This will not remain like this. I'm very sure that we will only have space for about 5 to 6, maybe large OEMs who will cover over 75% of the global market. And then we will have the niche players, a handful of niche players who serve certain niche markets. This consolidation is happening. There's a couple of indications that companies in the private equity area are investing into startups, looking to invest into startups, consolidating, not startups, investing into PBF OEM. And we see that also in other industrial areas that a couple of firms are looking at this market right now, acquiring OEMs, merging them, and trying to make them beneficial, trying to become one of the larger OEMs on the market. Into the picture of consolidation also fits the market pricing development. We also look at this regularly in our report. So if we look into pricing developments, we can see with those examples here, aluminum gets cheaper, stainless steel gets cheaper, titanium gets cheaper. So those materials on the market, if you buy them as parts at part manufacturing offices, service providers, if you might say, you can see that you pay less 2024 compared to 2023. And also the range gets smaller, and those are all very good indicators for a consolidating market. Now, what's the story behind all this data, and why am I showing you this? Because the data gives you the baseline for each strategy, and I don't want to dive too deep into other segments that are also important for a strategy. For example, your customer, your technology, your IP rights, etc. But if we just look at data and start with the market environment as one of the, let's say, most important factors, I think, for a strategy, we have a very clear baseline right now. So what I said earlier, we can clearly say is that 3D printing doesn't sell itself anymore. 10, 15 years ago, you could be any 3D printing startup by just developing a somewhat new technology, offering a certain 3D printer. It was like AI today. It's very easy to get funding. It was very easy to get your first customers. But then we clearly see now how difficult it is to actually build manufacturing machines, especially in the industrial area, or consumer products that work well, that are now coming primarily from China in the 3D printing area. So 3D printing is not selling itself anymore. What is in the middle, and that's important for strategy, what is getting into the middle of every focus is the customer and the application. They are driving the demand right now. Venture capital is decreasing, that's clear. Large firms are divesting, so it is much more focused now to actually get cash, to actually become profitable in this market. And that's why some players are leaving the space, because profitability is now what is focused. So I said a couple of times, 600 machine OEM and about 40 technology variants, and they're fighting over only 2.6 billion euros market. This means that not only on the OEM side, in terms of numbers of players in the market, or also from technologies, not all those technologies will survive. And explicitly, not many of them will become large generalists in this market. Many of them will remain just niche players for maybe one very specific application where they can be profitable. But in 3D printing, we will see a consolidation both in the OEM side and in the technology side as well. Machine prices are decreasing. It doesn't make sense anymore to offer a machine now at a premium price if it doesn't deliver superior productivity, especially. Quality doesn't count so much anymore. Quality, many are playing in that area of high quality machines. It's a lot about pricing and productivity now as well. Also, in terms of application sweet spots, we clearly see now where additive can add value. It's not a big question anymore, because nowadays it's pretty clear where additive can create value. And in polymer, it's mass customization. So in polymer, it's always about individual designs, often related to shapes that have to be individualized. So, for example, everything that goes onto the body, into the body, or at a human being or so. So everything that you need to individualize has a very good sweet spot in polymer. That counts for the majority of applications we see there. Similar to jigs, toolings, fixtures, etc. Everything that needs to be mass customized in a way is a sweet spot for polymers. Metal has a sweet spot on performance, so everything that's related to high performance parts. So this is a baseline for forming a strategy. Now, there are many ways of creating a strategy or working on developing a strategy. It's always a bit of an abstract word. I had my own difficulties when I started with that about 8 years ago. So I always had the question, what is actually a strategy? Nobody can really tell you what is a strategy. Everything is a strategy somehow. So what is a strategy? It's about what you want to offer. How do you want to offer it? You want to sell the product, and how do you want to be seen in the market? Do you want to be seen as the one who provides the best quality, or the one who wants to provide the best pricing point, or everything at the same time? That's a difficult thing. The first thing I learned about strategies, well, actually, it's not the first thing. It was the first real useful thing I learned about strategies, is that it means turn down. So strategy is a lot about focus, and that counts explicitly in the additive realm. The problem with additive manufacturing or 3D printing is that it can do so many things. If you develop a metal, polymer, ceramic, whatever 3D printing technology, you're suddenly offered with a big range of opportunities, because you can do so many things with it. You can do tools, you can do prototypes, we know that. But you can do so many different products in medical, in energy, in consumer goods, or whatever. And you quickly realize that you're losing focus. The more diverse you look into the markets, the more likely you're going to lose focus. And that's not a strategy, to lose this focus and not really understand your market. So the first point is the focus. And I over the time, I adapted a model in helping companies form a good strategy, which some of you might be familiar with. It's honestly, I don't know the name. It's the C model, but it describes very well a way of a first step of having a strategy. And as I mentioned, it's a lot about focus. So what is this? What does the scheme here look like? We have 3 different areas where you can play. You can either decide, and let's stick to make it easier, let's stick with a machine OEM. So let's assume we are a machine OEM working on a strategy. You could pick 3 areas where you want to be best in class. Either product leadership. That's what was driving 3D printing in the past years. It was about innovation. It was about being the first. It was about high talent. The people were fighting about the talent in 3D printing. That was product leadership. So people were trying to build the best 3D printer on the market, or the fastest, or whatever. Now, there's another one. It's operational excellence. I like to call it the IKEA or the Walmart or whatever. So they're not really focusing on building the best product, but they're building the product that has the easiest entry for a customer, or the lowest cost, so the least hassle to interact with. So you can easily buy it, you can easily use it, you can easily upgrade it, or whatever. So there are ways in this type of strategy where you can address a very big customer group. However, it often tends to be also affecting the margin. You mostly need to sell a lot of printers because you're not necessarily the best printer on the market, but you're offering a very easy access. The best example for that in the 3D printing market, I would say, is currently someone like Formlabs or Bamboo Labs. Basically, they're offering a very low entry threshold. You can very easily buy those machines, operate them. The cost, the investment is low, etc. So This is another focus you can choose. The third focus is customer intimacy. Here, you're building the best solution for a very specific customer. And this means, why is it customer intimacy? Because it means you need to know a lot about customers. It's a strategy that companies like Carbon, for example, could be an example in the 3D printing world. Carbon, a couple of years ago, stopped aggressively selling the printer or the technology. They started at product leadership. They started with advertising a DLP printer, basically, that had a couple of very nice features and this continuous printing technology. They're not advertising that so much anymore. Right now, they're focusing a lot on a couple of very specific applications where they're trying to understand their customers very well. Now, the important thing here is, if you look at all those three areas, you might tend to say, well, I want to be best in all of them. And that's the critical thing, because that doesn't work. And that has been proven in many studies. I don't need to reference all of those here, but in the market, it has been proven that it's nearly impossible in such a high demanding and competitive market to become best in all three of those areas. You have to choose one where you are best in class and focus everything on that. The important thing is, though, you cannot completely neglect the other two areas. You still need to have a good product. So let's say you want to focus on customer intimacy. You cannot build the most expensive printer. You can also not build and have a very high entry threshold. Then in operational excellence, you are not in the leading group. You need to be still in the leading group of the top 10. The same in product leadership. Here, you cannot build the best printer on the market, but you at least need to be the second, third, or fourth best in the market when it comes to innovation and technology leadership. So focus on one and be in the leading group at the other two. And focusing is the first thing you need to learn about strategies. I made a couple more examples, but given the time, I need to get a bit faster going, otherwise I'm going to lose myself here. I could talk about this forever, but there's a couple of things. It's going to be in the slides in the end, so you're going to be able to recreate those steps and check it afterwards. So we talk about product leadership, where it's a lot about driving innovation, trying to bring out the last piece of technology to the market. Someone like Apple might be also a good example in this area. Operational excellence, we talked about customer intimacy as well. So now maybe a couple of words on how you can actually achieve that. Let's take a next step. What do you need to do in order, if you decided for a certain area and you decided, I want to play in this area because it's accessible from my current status that I have, and I'm already in the leading group in a certain area. I have a good starting point here. I want to focus on customer intimacy, for example. There are a couple of things that you need to look at your portfolio. And then I'm going to focus here a little bit on this customer intimacy area, because that's where a lot of companies trend towards right now. And if you want to look at customer intimacy, first of all, you have to understand the market, the customer, the customer yourself. You need to actually start talking to the customer. You also need to check your internal portfolio and the customer fit to it. Does your product actually solve the customer's problem? Those are things someone in operational excellence doesn't necessarily worry about. He just wants to build an easy access 3D printer because he knows 3D printing itself has a market and it works. So I'm just building a printer for everyone out there. But if you want to go into customer leadership and customer intimacy, you need to have a very close look at your portfolio if that actually fits into the customer needs, and can you add on certain functionalities that improve the customer experience. You also need to look at the customer related processes. It doesn't make sense if you have the best selling product on the market in terms of customer intimacy, but your processes are so slow, the customer is frustrated with you. it's all about, in customer intimacy, it's all about the customer interaction and keeping the customer happy, which means if he has a problem, there needs to be an answer at least a couple of minutes later, a couple of hours later, maybe. And you need to know how to interact with this customer. If you have very slow processes in the background that have no clear jurisdiction and nobody really knows who cares about the problem of the customer, or it takes forever to give them an answer, it's a problem. So it's something that you need to work on in your strategy and build out in terms of your company structure. I promised you also to look a little bit into the AM user strategy. And like I said, we can talk forever about how to implement strategies, how to work on strategies. But I in this webinar, I just wanted to give an overview on some of the things we're working on, some of the things we're working with. Successful user strategies is much more difficult, I would say, than the supply chain, because users really depend on their own application field. And traditionally, 3D printing started with the unknown, basically, because companies did not really know yet what to use it for. They used it for primarily prototyping. That was the first step, just giving engineers access to printing capacities, enabled them to speed up their engineering and design process. Then it went to tools, and also very early on, some companies, especially in medical, realized the big potential. If you look at hearing aids, it's a very old application in 3D printing, or a hip implant, for example, has been in the market forever already. But it means, again, a little bit about focus. As you realize already, you see here just exemplary 4 different areas where additive can add value. And the problem is many companies can find themselves in every part and every aspect of this. Look at an aerospace company. They can use it for spare parts, the top left corner, an improvement of a service or aftermarket. They could use it for design and development and research, and they certainly do use it for that. They can use it for improvement of a manufacturing process. I'm sure a lot of aerospace companies are using jigs, tools, fixtures that are printed. And mostly in aerospace, you can use it for improvement of the actual end product. Now, the problem is, do you actually need a strategy to cover all of that? Not necessary in an aerospace company. You probably just have to build different kind of departments for each of those areas. Or in terms of prototyping, you don't need a department at all, and you don't need necessarily a strategy for that, because that's easily running by itself. But for building in products, bringing products in the market, end products, needs a clear strategy. And that is probably completely different from the one in after sales and aftermarket. So first of all, be clear about where additive manufacturing can add value and where you actually want to focus on in the company in terms of which areas you need a strategy for and which areas are just running by themselves or can be run by smaller units. So for example, in the bottom right corner with manufacturing tools, this is typically an area that works best bottom up. If you're simply enabling smaller groups on the shop floor to utilize 3D printing, you can get very, very great results without even putting a big strategy on top of that. It's also what I also want to mention, and we saw that a lot in user companies that are really successful at implementing AM. It's about marketing. It's about internal marketing. You need to understand that you need to get everyone on board, and you need to communicate the success you have, because the implementation barriers is sometimes extremely high, and the resistance against new technologies is in some cases very high. In other cases, it's easy, but in often cases, there you find a lot of people who see maybe their own areas in danger, so their own jurisdictions or responsibilities, and they're trying to fight the technology. Internal marketing is important. Getting all the stakeholders on board, including management, including quality, including production, etc. You need to get everyone on board who is involved in additive and communicate a lot. Last point, combining bottom-up approach and broad training with top-down management support has also been proven very successful. We've seen top-down approaches of trying to push additive into a company in most cases, it simply didn't work. In most cases, it ended up with machines being unused, sitting in a corner, just collecting dust. All right, getting to an end, so I need to hurry up a little bit. Just one last slide with a couple of learnings that came to my mind. I mean, the most important learning is, for me, we have to understand that 3D printing doesn't sell itself anymore, which means we need a strategy. First of all, is accepting the need for a strategy. Refocusing on profitability is extremely important. That means also innovations will be slowed down. It means that because we don't have strong investments anymore, companies are much more focusing now on actually selling more printers rather than funding new innovations. AM user have to anticipate market consolidation. It's also an important point that I haven't mentioned yet, but indirectly, it's a clear learning combining those messages, because you have to decide today. In which 3D printing technology you want to invest, because it might be the company's not around anymore tomorrow. So make sure to make a good decision on that if you are a user. All right, I jumped through a lot of slides. I hope I didn't overwhelm you. And I'm happy to answer a couple of questions if they're there.
Thank you, Matthias.
Go ahead.
Appreciate the excellent presentation. Additive manufacturing remains a very hot topic, so it's not surprising we do have some questions here. And remember, you can still submit one, and if you're unable to stick around till the end, you can also revisit this webinar anytime that you wish. So let's see what we've got here. First question, standardization helps drive adoption. Which standards organization do you see becoming the leader in AM standards? ASTM, ISO, SAE?
I would definitely say ASTM is doing the best job here and being the most visible, and probably a latter point is much more important than who's doing the best job, because they are being visible is important, because a standard doesn't work if nobody knows that the standard is around. And I think the ASTM is doing a really good job at working, first of all, gathering the need for standards and bringing people together, creating the standards. It can never be fast enough. It always takes forever, unfortunately. But they're creating the standards, and they're also publishing it and creating an ecosystem around all the things that are related to qualification, bringing products to an industrial manufacturing shop floor. So I would say it's ASTM. But to be honest, I'm not completely familiar with many others in this area, so my judgment might be a bit clouded. But those are definitely the ones most visible to the market and most active, I would assume. There are a couple of organizations that are very important for a certain focus area. For example, in spare parts, you might want to look at D&V or so. So there are a couple of organizations that have to do that are working on oil and gas or things like that. And those might be extremely important in this area, or FDA in terms of medical, for example. So keep those specialized standardization organizations also in mind. But overall, ASTM, I think, is doing a pretty good job.
Great, thank you. Another question here from an attendee. Compared with the US, where the Department of Defense has fielded machines, but RFQ volume for AM production parts remains thin, what are you actually seeing in Europe on defense adoption? Specifically, are RFQs for additively manufactured end-use parts increasing, flat, or sporadic? And what's driving that? Qualification hurdles, budgeting, procurement flow, limited validated use cases?
That's a tough question. I mean, to be honest, since being German, I don't necessarily have clearance to have a look into the full spectrum of additive things that are happening in the US. But a lot of it is public, and a lot of our customers are also working in that area. So we have some visibility to it. It's interesting. I mean, most applications we see are somewhat short-term solution. At least when we look at the applications that are coming from military units themselves and service members in that area, it's mostly about short-term solutions to so it falls under somewhat spare parts maintenance in a different area. When it comes to actual and that certainly will continue to grow. However, I think it will slow down at some point, because what's happening right now is there's a lot of money being thrown at that area, a lot of capacity. At some point, companies will realize it's a certain saturation until they find the way of growth again. And I think those solutions will be very specialized also for those areas in terms of the machines they're going to use and the infrastructure, the software process chain, etc. Will be quite focused in this area on the spare parts or those short-term solutions. There's the other world of defense that brings me to the OEM, so actually equipment for defense, so shipbuilders, rocket builders, etc. There's a different case, of course. There we see the growth more on the performance side, similar to aerospace or to energy or other industries. I hope that answers the very complex question.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. Okay, another question here. How does the current strength of the defense market influence AM strategy, and are there regional differences with that?
Yeah, it's a good question, because there are definitely regional differences. I mean, defense is always sensitive, so that always means only a certain pool of suppliers has access to this market. We see that with Western companies having access to the defense market in the US, but which also becomes limited today already. So certain areas are not open for Western suppliers if you don't have a base in the US, for example. And at the same time, you see a lot of activities going on in China, or more like you don't see them. It's more like you are aware of them and you can indirectly sense them. So, for example, if a company tells you certain areas are their focus industries, there might be a big gap of where the other 50% of the machines are going, or material or services. So this it really has an impact on strategy if you want to play in this area. Right now, it's still opportunistic. I don't see it much in the strategy of many companies. It's more opportunistic than strategic. But some companies are reshifting their strategies right now to serve the defense market, at least at a certain percent of their focus.
Great. Another question here. This is from an international standpoint, how should AM companies in the US and Europe prepare for Chinese competitors?
Yeah, Chinese competitors are on the market in some areas more than in others. So if we look at industrial systems, we see less footprint in the US than in Europe. If we look at the consumer footprint, though, that's probably similar distributed in the US and Europe. And given the fact that many industrial customers are now tending and looking towards a consumer or prosumer types of printers that are often coming from Chinese OEMs, it is clear that also the Western OEMs have to shift their strategy and offer those machines and bring their knowledge and technology into lower end markets, into the prosumer market. So it's difficult because it's really depending on which technology we talk about, which type of OEM we talk about. But the Chinese competition definitely needs to be a part of the strategy.
Great, thank you. And just before we finish up here, reminder to attendees, if you want to send in any other questions for Matthias, now's the time to do it. So please get those in. And in the meantime, Matthias, just a kind of a broader question for you. What's your outlook for AM for 2026 and beyond, just generally speaking?
I think we will see more prosumer printers on the market. So we will see more companies offering low-cost metal PBF and low-cost polymer PBF printers, and companies who primarily before offered higher-priced FDM machines or even DED machines offering also more entry-level systems. So a lot of them are working on smaller machines, smaller scale machine that we will see on the market more at Formnext, because companies are not investing as much anymore. As I said, the overall price point per unit is decreasing. And I think at Formnext, we will see many more of those machines. I think the trend towards the very large frames that we've seen last year was kind of the contrary of that. So we saw a lot of those very large, especially metal PBF machines. I think we've reached a certain limit. There will be other competitors in Western suppliers entering those markets because they're being pushed by defense, energy, etc., to get into that market. But overall, we don't see those machines beyond 2 meters really continuing to grow as much as they did previously. And we see more the lower end of prosumers increasing.
Great. And we just saw a question come in while you were answering that one. What is low cost PBF threshold?
Good question. You could spend hours just discussing that actually, but it's useless in the end. Low cost is a good question. Consumer, prosumer, industrial, I think those labels I hear most often by now. And I would say, even if I might have used low cost in some cases, and consumer is something for me in the area of maximum 1,000 euros. I think this is the maximum a normal consumer would pay for a printer. Prosumer would be for me in the area of up to 5,000, and then everything above 5 goes into the industrial area. Some of my colleagues might argue that starts at 10,000. That's why we started there before with our report. Low cost also kind of relates to, I mean, you asked specifically what is low cost PBF threshold, right? So, I mean, the lowest PBF machine right now is probably in this area of 40K or so, or 35, I think. No, there's lower ones. It's not true. There had been lower cost machines in the 10K area as well. So, yeah, where's the threshold? To be honest, I cannot 100% answer that really, because it depends really on the definition of low cost in this case.
That makes sense. Thank you. Okay, so unless we have any other questions, I think we're going to wrap up for now. But I want to thank you again, Matthias, for this very informative presentation on an extremely timely topic. It was very valuable, and I want to thank our attendees for your participation and the great questions that came in. We hope you found this content as rewarding as we did, and you'll join us again soon. Until then, please remember that SME and SME Media are here to help you stay up to date on all things manufacturing. You can find links to podcasts, webinars like this one with AMPOWER, publications, and news by visiting us at advancedmanufacturing.org. Thank you for tuning in.